The airport was alive with the usual mixture of noise and movement. The rolling sound of suitcase wheels, the distant announcements over the loudspeakers, and the soft hum of travelers chatting all blended into the background. Marcus Carter stepped out of the boarding tunnel and into the narrow aisle of the plane. He was dressed neatly in a dark blue jacket, plain shirt, and simple jeans. His clothes were not flashy, but his presence carried a quiet confidence. His eyes scanned the row numbers until he found his seat, 12A by the window. It was a small relief. Marcus liked window seats. Watching the clouds pass beneath him always gave him peace. He placed his carry-on bag carefully in the overhead compartment, making sure it fit without blocking anyone else's space. Then he sat down, sliding his backpack under the seat in front of him. The seat felt comfortable enough, and he took a slow breath. After 2 weeks of traveling for work, he was finally heading home. More passengers began filing in behind him. Some smiled politely as they passed. Others were too busy juggling their bags and boarding passes to notice anyone. Marcus nodded to the few who made eye contact. He had always believed that a little kindness, even something as small as a nod, could brighten someone's day. 2 rows ahead, a woman in her late 40s stopped in the aisle to stow her bag. She wore a crisp white sweater and a pair of sunglasses perched on her head. She moved with the kind of care that suggested she liked things to be exactly the way she wanted them. Marcus didn't pay much attention at first. Passengers came in, all types after all. But as she turned to sit down, their eyes met briefly. Marcus gave a small, friendly smile. She didn't return it. Instead, she glanced at him for a moment longer than seemed necessary before facing forward. Her expression was unreadable, but it carried a certain stiffness. The steady flow of passengers continued. A family with 2 small children settled a few rows behind Marcus, their cheerful chatter filling the air. A businessman in a gray suit took the aisle seat next to him, giving Marcus a quick nod before opening his laptop. The hum of boarding was normal until Marcus noticed that the same woman from earlier had turned in her seat again. She looked back at him, not with curiosity, but with an almost measuring gaze, as if she were trying to figure something out. Marcus raised an eyebrow but said nothing. People sometimes stared for no real reason. He focused instead on the runway, view through his window. Outside, ground crew in bright vests moved about with practiced efficiency, guiding carts of luggage and preparing the plane for departure. A few minutes later, the woman reached for the overhead call button above her seat. The small light clicked on, and within moments, a flight attendant appeared. She was a young woman with a professional smile and a calm tone. "Yes, ma'am? How can I help you?" the attendant asked politely. The woman leaned closer and began, speaking quietly. Her words were too soft for Marcus to hear, but her occasional glance over her shoulder in his direction made it clear he was somehow part of her concern. The attendant's expression stayed neutral, though her eyebrows lifted. Just slightly. She nodded once, then said, "I understand, ma'am. I'll check on that." Marcus kept his gaze out the window, but his ears were listening. Years of working in environments where attention to detail mattered had made him sensitive to shifts in tone, body language, and mood. Something about the woman's actions told him this wasn't a simple request about snacks or seat comfort. The flight attendant made her way toward him. She paused at his row, leaning slightly to speak without, disturbing the businessman next to him. "Excuse me, sir," she said kindly. "May I see your boarding pass, please?" Marcus turned his head and met her eyes. They were calm, but carried a hint of hesitation. "Of course," he replied, his voice even. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out the small folded paper. The attendant glanced at it, checking the seat number and flight details. "Thank you," she said, handing it back. "Everything's fine. Enjoy your flight." She moved on, but Marcus noticed that the woman in the white sweater had turned her head again. Their eyes met for a second time, and this time he didn't smile. He simply held her gaze until she looked away. The businessman beside him had noticed too. "Strange," he muttered, almost under his breath, before returning to his laptop. Marcus leaned back in his seat, his mind quiet but alert. He wasn't angry, not yet, but he felt the faint shift in the air, that invisible tension that sometimes starts without anyone saying a word out loud. He reminded himself that this was just the beginning of the flight. Plenty of things could happen before they landed. For now, he would wait, watch, and see where this was going. Outside, a luggage cart drove past, and the airport ground crew continued their work. The sky was clear, the sun bright against the silver wings of the plane. Inside, though, Marcus sensed that this journey might not be as peaceful as he had hoped. Somewhere ahead, in row 10, the woman sat stiffly in her seat, her hands folded in her lap. She didn't press the call button again. Not yet. But her occasional backward glances told Marcus she wasn't done. And so, in the quiet hum of passengers settling in, a silent story had already begun to take shape, one that would soon pull everyone's attention away from their books, screens, and conversations. Marcus knew he could handle it. What he didn't know was how quickly the moment would come when he'd have to. The seatbelt sign had not yet turned on, and passengers were still settling in. Flight attendants moved up and down the aisle, helping people find their seats and stowing last-minute bags. Marcus sat quietly in 12A, his gaze shifting between the bustling activity outside the window and the calm but focused movement of the crew inside. He had already decided he wouldn't think too much about the woman's earlier glance or her whispered words to the attendant. Flights were long. There was no need to start one with tension. But some things had a way of following you, even when you tried to ignore them. A few rows ahead, the woman in the white sweater sat upright, her back almost too straight. Her eyes darted around the cabin before landing again, briefly, on Marcus. She quickly looked forward when she noticed he was watching. Her fingers tapped lightly against her folded hands. Then, as if deciding something, she pressed the overhead call button again. This time, the senior flight attendant came, a tall man with silver hair and a voice that carried authority even in a whisper. He leaned down, listening as the woman spoke. Her voice was low, but Marcus could see the way she gestured with her hand. Small, quick movements that seemed meant to signal urgency. Marcus caught only fragments of her words. Don't feel safe. Think it's suspicious. Not sure he should be here. The senior attendant listened without interrupting, his face neutral. When she finished, he asked something softly, and she nodded, glancing over her shoulder in Marcus's direction. The attendant gave her a short, polite smile and walked away. Not toward Marcus, but toward the front of the plane. The businessman, next to Marcus, paused his typing and looked at him with a questioning eyebrow. "Do you know her?" he asked. "No," Marcus replied, his tone calm but clipped. "I've never seen her before in my life." The businessman shrugged but kept watching the woman with mild curiosity. "Strange," he murmured again. A moment later, the first flight attendant, the same young woman from before, returned to Marcus's row. She crouched slightly so she could speak without disturbing the passengers around them. "Sir," she began, her voice professional but softer than before, "one of our passengers has expressed concern. I just want to assure you you're not in any trouble. This is just part of our standard procedure to make everyone feel comfortable." Marcus kept his expression calm. "You've already seen my boarding pass," he said evenly. "Yes," she acknowledged quickly. "And everything is fine. I just need to check with the captain that we're clear to proceed. It's nothing personal." He gave a small nod. "Understood." She offered a brief smile and stepped away, disappearing, toward the front. The murmurs had started. A man in the aisle seat across from Marcus leaned slightly toward his seatmate, whispering. A teenager a few rows back tilted her head curiously, eyes flicking between Marcus and the woman in white. Marcus had been in situations like this before, not on planes, but in other public spaces, where suspicion had no reason but still managed to grow like a shadow. He had learned long ago that responding too soon only gave fuel to it. The best response for now was patience. Through the small oval window, the runway glistened in the sunlight. The ground crew rolled the last cart of luggage toward the plane. A line of other aircraft stood waiting in the distance, their tails marked with different airline logos. Everything outside was normal, calm, efficient. Inside, the tension stretched, thin. The woman in the white sweater didn't speak to anyone else. She kept her eyes forward now, her jaw set, but Marcus could feel the weight of her decision pressing against the air in the cabin. She had made up her mind about him, and she had gone to the crew with it, twice. The young flight attendant returned once more, this time with the senior attendant beside her. They stopped at Marcus's row. "Sir," the senior attendant said, politely, "we've confirmed your information and you're good to go. I appreciate your patience." Marcus nodded. "No problem." The young attendant added, "If you need anything during the flight, please don't hesitate to ask." They left as quickly as they had arrived, their professionalism intact, but Marcus noticed how the senior attendant gave the woman in white a short glance as they passed her row. It wasn't unkind, but it was the kind of glance that silently said, "Enough." Still, Marcus could sense it wasn't over. The woman shifted in her seat, adjusting her sweater sleeves and sitting even straighter than before. The businessman beside Marcus closed his laptop. "Well," he said quietly, "I think you're about to have the most interesting flight of all of us." Marcus didn't answer. He simply turned back to the window, the faint reflection of his own face staring back at him in the glass. His expression was steady, but inside, a part of him began preparing, just in case. The engines outside started their low, steady rumble, a vibration running through the floor beneath his shoes. The captain's voice came over the speakers, welcoming everyone on board and giving details about the flight time. People relaxed, thinking the matter was over. But Marcus knew better. Some tensions don't fade until they break, and this one, he could tell, was still building. The plane had begun to move slowly away from the gate. The low hum of the engines filled the cabin, and the seatbelt sign lit up overhead. Flight attendants walked through the aisle to check seatbelts and carry-on bags one last time. Marcus stayed, quiet in his window seat, watching the ground crew wave their orange batons as the aircraft turned toward the taxiway. Beside him, the businessman had set his laptop aside, clearly sensing there was more to watch inside the cabin than on any screen. 2 rows ahead, the woman in the white sweater was not done, though she had stopped calling the attendants for the moment. Her body language said plenty. She sat with her shoulders tense, glancing at Marcus every few minutes. Each time their eyes met, she would look away quickly, but not quickly enough to hide the fact that she was still keeping track of him. The businessman leaned slightly toward Marcus. "She's still thinking about you," he murmured. "I've noticed," Marcus replied in a calm tone. As the plane rolled down the taxiway, the young flight attendant returned, moving with quiet purpose. She stopped beside Marcus's row, crouched, down again, and spoke in a voice low enough to be polite, but loud enough to be heard clearly. "Sir, I'm sorry to bother you again," she began, "but the passenger in row 10 has raised another concern. She believes—" The attendant hesitated, as though choosing her words carefully. "She believes you may be in the wrong seat or on the wrong ticket." Marcus raised one eyebrow. "Even after you've checked my boarding pass twice?" "I understand how frustrating this must be," the attendant said, her voice steady. "I've explained to her that everything is in order, but she's insistent. The senior attendant has asked me to verify your identification." The businessman next to Marcus looked surprised. "Identification? That's a bit much, isn't it?" "It's entirely optional, sir," the attendant explained, glancing between them. But if you don't mind, it might help us settle the situation so we can all have a smooth flight." Marcus took a slow breath. He could feel a few nearby passengers leaning subtly in their seats, curious. He wasn't angry, not yet, but he understood exactly what was happening. Sometimes suspicion didn't die when it was proven wrong. Sometimes it grew stubborn and dug in deeper. "All right," Marcus said finally, his voice even. "I'll cooperate." He reached into his jacket, not hurriedly, but with measured movements. He pulled out his leather wallet and opened it, taking out his driver's license. The attendant glanced at it, matched the name with the boarding pass, and gave a satisfied nod. "Thank you, sir," she said warmly. "That clears everything." As she stood, Marcus spoke in a tone calm enough for only her and the businessman to hear. "I don't want to cause any trouble, but this is the third time. If she keeps this up, I'd like the crew to handle it without disturbing the whole cabin." The attendant nodded in understanding. "We'll take care of it." She walked away, stopping briefly at the woman's row. Her words were too soft for anyone else to hear, but Marcus could see the way the woman's chin lifted slightly in response, as if unwilling to admit defeat. The businessman let out a quiet chuckle. Some people just can't let go. Marcus didn't answer. Instead, he turned his gaze back to the runway. The plane was now lined up, engines roaring louder. A slight push against the back of the seat told him they were accelerating. The sound of tires on the tarmac grew until it shifted into the soft whoosh of liftoff. They were airborne. The seatbelt sign stayed on as the plane climbed, but passengers began to relax. Conversations picked up, children laughed, and a few people closed their eyes for a nap. The earlier tension seemed to have faded for most, but not for Marcus. He had the distinct feeling this wasn't over. Sure enough, about 10 minutes into the flight, the woman twisted in her seat again. She didn't press the call button this time. Instead, she waited for a passing attendant and spoke quietly. This time, Marcus couldn't hear even fragments of her words, but he could read the attendant's face. There was that same polite mask, the same patient nod. The attendant walked toward the back, perhaps to report to the senior crew member. The businessman shook his head in disbelief. "She's determined." Marcus gave a small, humorless smile. "Yes, and I have a feeling she's about to take it further." Outside, the sunlight washed the clouds in bright white. The world below was peaceful, silent and far away, a sharp contrast to the unspoken storm brewing in the cabin. Marcus leaned back, closing his eyes for a moment. He had handled plenty of tense situations in his career, but there was always something different about being in a confined space, thousands of feet in the air, with nowhere to go. He knew that eventually he might have to make things clear, not just to the woman, but to everyone on board. But timing mattered. Right now, it was better to let the situation come to him, and from the look in the woman's eyes when she glanced back yet again, he didn't have long to wait. The plane had leveled off now, cruising smoothly above a blanket of white clouds. The seatbelt sign switched off with a soft ding, and passengers began to move about. Some reached for books or tablets, others unbuckled to stretch their legs. The flight attendants rolled out the drink cart from the front of the cabin. Marcus stayed in his seat, quietly watching the sunlight reflect off the wing outside. He could almost imagine the flight settling into normalcy. Almost. But his instincts told him otherwise. 2 rows ahead, the woman in the white sweater was still upright and tense, her posture never relaxing. She glanced back again, catching Marcus's eye for a fraction of a second, before turning away sharply. It was as though she didn't want to be caught looking, but couldn't stop herself from doing it. The businessman next to Marcus, now sipping coffee, leaned slightly toward him. "I'd bet good money she's not finished," he said in a low voice. Marcus gave a small, knowing nod. "Neither would I." It didn't take long. As the drink cart reached her row, the woman ordered a glass of water, but instead of facing forward after receiving it, she leaned toward the young flight attendant. Her voice was quiet, but her gestures were unmistakable. A small nod in Marcus's direction, a hand motion suggesting a subtle complaint. The attendant listened, her polite smile never wavering. But there was a faint strain in her eyes now. She said something brief in return, and for a moment it looked like she might move on. But the woman shook her head firmly, speaking again with more emphasis. Marcus watched the exchange, his patience thinning but his face calm. Finally, the attendant gave a short nod and stepped away from the cart. She approached Marcus's row, her expression careful. "Sir," she began gently, "I apologize for the repeated interruptions. The passenger in row 10 has questioned your presence again. She's suggesting that you may have boarded without proper clearance." The businessman let out an incredulous laugh. "This is getting ridiculous." Marcus remained composed, though his voice carried a firmer edge now. "And what exactly would she like you to do about it?" The attendant shifted slightly. "She's asked if we can confirm your travel details with the captain. I've already told her there's no issue, but she's persistent." Marcus looked past the attendant to the woman in white, who was pretending to read a magazine but kept glancing over the top of the pages. He sighed quietly. "All right," he said, "but this will be the last time. I'm happy to clear this up once and for all." The attendant nodded, clearly relieved he was willing to cooperate. "Thank you, sir." As she walked away toward the front, Marcus folded his hands in his lap. The businessman raised an eyebrow. "You're handling this better than most people would." Marcus allowed a faint smile. "It's not the first time I've dealt with misunderstandings." From the front of the cabin, Marcus could see the attendant speaking briefly with the senior crew member. Both glanced back toward him before disappearing behind the cockpit door. Minutes passed. The hum of the engines and the quiet clink of cups on the drink cart filled the space. Passengers seemed to sense something was going on, even if they didn't know exactly what. A few exchanged curious looks. A couple of them even leaned into the aisle slightly, as if expecting an announcement. Finally, the senior attendant returned to Marcus's row. He crouched slightly to speak at eye level. "Sir, we've double-checked everything with the captain. You are completely clear to be here, as we already knew. I want to thank you for your patience." Marcus nodded once. "I appreciate you confirming." The senior attendant straightened, his gaze flicking briefly to the woman in white before he moved away. This time, he didn't stop at her row, but his quick glance seemed to carry a silent message. The matter was closed, or at least, it should have been. But Marcus could tell by the way the woman's lips pressed into a thin line that she wasn't ready to drop it. Her pride, perhaps, or her conviction that she was right, wouldn't allow her to simply let the matter go. The businessman shook his head in disbelief. "Some people dig themselves into a hole and just keep going." Marcus chuckled softly, though there was no humor in it. "True, but eventually the hole swallows them up." Outside, the clouds rolled endlessly beneath the plane. Inside, Marcus could feel the weight of the next move building. She had tested him 3 times already, and each time the crew had proven him right. But people like that rarely stopped because of facts alone. He leaned back, resting his head against the seat. If she came at him directly, he would be ready. And something in the set of her shoulders told him that moment was coming sooner than later. The flight had settled into its mid-cruise rhythm. Most passengers were busy with their own activities, reading, listening to music, or sipping their drinks. The clink of ice in plastic cups mixed with the steady hum of the engines. Marcus sat still in his seat, his gaze fixed out the window. The world below was nothing but endless clouds, white and calm. Inside, however, he could feel the air in the cabin tightening again. The woman in the white sweater had been quiet for several minutes, but Marcus knew that quietness was not the same as surrender. She was waiting, planning her next step. The businessman beside him had opened a novel but wasn't turning pages. "I don't think she's done," he said under his breath. Marcus gave a small nod without looking away from the window. Neither do I. It started again when the senior attendant passed by, checking on passengers. The woman leaned into the aisle, catching his attention. She spoke in a low but urgent tone, her words shielded by the hum of the engines. Marcus couldn't hear her exact sentence, but the way she pointed, just slightly, toward his row left no doubt who she was talking about. The senior attendant listened, his face a careful mask of professionalism. Then he gave a short nod, excused himself, and walked toward the front of the plane. The businessman raised an eyebrow. That didn't look good. Moments later, the senior attendant returned, but this time he was joined by another crew member Marcus hadn't seen before, a tall man in a dark blazer, likely the lead purser. Both stopped at Marcus's row. "Sir," the purser began in a calm but formal tone, "I'm sorry to disturb you again. We've had a passenger express a strong concern about your presence on board. She's requested that we verify your travel details directly with the captain and security protocols." Marcus tilted his head slightly. "You've already verified everything, more than once." "I understand," the purser said, his voice steady. "And we have no reason to question your status. However, she's insisted this is a matter of passenger safety. To avoid any unnecessary disruption to the flight, we'd like to confirm one final detail. Would you be willing to speak with the captain when he's available?" The businessman shook his head in disbelief. "This is absurd. He's done everything you've asked." Marcus glanced at the businessman, then back at the purser. His voice was calm, but it carried a quiet authority now. "I will cooperate, but after this, I expect this matter to be closed." The purser gave a single nod. "Understood, sir." As they stepped away, Marcus could feel eyes on him from other rows. Some passengers looked curious, others uneasy. Whispers spread in low tones. It was the kind of attention Marcus disliked, not because it bothered him personally, but because it turned a private misunderstanding into a public spectacle. The woman in the white sweater kept her face turned forward, her magazine open but unread. The corners of her mouth curved just slightly upward, as though she believed she was winning. Marcus folded his hands in his lap, his mind already made up. He had given her more than enough chances to stop on her own. If she pushed again, he would end it, quickly and without drama, but in a way that would leave no room for doubt. About 20 minutes later, the purser returned. "The captain will see you in the front galley, sir," he said politely. Marcus rose from his seat. The businessman gave him a supportive nod. "Good luck," he murmured. Walking through the narrow aisle, Marcus passed the woman in the white sweater. She didn't look up, but he could see the faint flicker of satisfaction in her expression. At the front of the plane, Marcus stood with the captain and purser in the small galley area. The captain, a middle-aged man with a steady gaze, extended his hand. "I understand there's been some confusion," he said. "Yes," Marcus replied simply, "and I'd like to clear it up once and for all." The conversation was short. Marcus provided the necessary details, his voice even and professional. When he was done, the captain nodded firmly. "That's all I need, sir. You're clear. I'll make sure my crew knows this is settled." "Thank you," Marcus said, and returned to his seat. As he walked past the woman again, he caught her eye. She looked away quickly, but this time there was no satisfaction in her face, only a flicker of uncertainty. Back in 12A, Marcus sat down and fastened his seatbelt. The businessman leaned closer. "Well?" "It's settled," Marcus said. "Or at least, it should be." But in his gut, he knew it might not be over until he took one last step, the step that would make her freeze in her seat and ensure there were no more questions. And if she pushed again, that moment would come. For a short while, it seemed like the matter had finally settled. The captain had spoken, the purser had confirmed, and the crew had moved on to normal duties. Passengers relaxed again, and the cabin filled with the quiet hum of conversation and the occasional clink of ice in cups. Marcus sat in his seat, sipping water and watching the clouds pass beneath them. The businessman beside him had gone back to his novel, though Marcus noticed he still glanced toward the woman in the white sweater now and then, as if expecting her to try again. And she did. It began subtly. She shifted in her seat, looked back, once, then twice. She took a slow sip of water, set her cup down, and pressed the call button for the fourth time. This time, the senior attendant came immediately, his face neutral, but his steps quicker than before. The woman spoke to him in low tones, her expression serious. She gestured faintly toward Marcus's row, and her head shook slightly, as though she were still convinced something was wrong. The senior attendant listened without interrupting, but when she finished, his answer was short. His polite smile was still there, but his voice carried a certain firmness as he replied. Marcus couldn't hear the words, but the meaning was clear. This needed to stop. Yet the woman persisted, her tone rising just slightly, enough for Marcus to catch fragments. Just don't think it's safe. You can't be sure. The attendant's patience was visibly thinning. Finally, he gave a small nod, perhaps just to end the exchange, and walked down the aisle toward Marcus. The businessman muttered, "Here we go again." The attendant crouched beside Marcus. "Sir, I am truly sorry for the repeated interruptions. This will be the last time, but the passenger is still insisting that you should provide further proof of your identity. She believes it's a matter of safety for everyone on board." Marcus looked him directly in the eye. "You've confirmed my ticket, my ID, and spoken with the captain. There's nothing more you need." The attendant nodded. "I agree, but if you're willing to address this one final time, it may put the matter to rest for good," Marcus thought for a moment. He had stayed quiet, patient, and cooperative for the entire flight. He had given her more chances than she deserved. But the moment had come to end it completely. His decision was calm and deliberate. "All right," Marcus said. "Let's finish this." The attendant stepped back as Marcus unfastened his seatbelt and stood. The businessman leaned back, watching closely. Marcus walked down the aisle until he stopped beside the woman's row. She looked up at him, startled by his sudden approach, but quickly straightened her shoulders as if preparing to stand her ground. Marcus spoke evenly, his voice steady enough for nearby passengers to hear without being loud. "Ma'am, I understand. You've had concerns about me since before the plane even left the gate." She hesitated, then replied, "I just think—" Marcus lifted a hand slightly, a polite gesture to let her know he wasn't finished. "You've asked the crew to check my ticket. They did. You've asked them to check my ID. They did. You've even asked them to confirm with the captain. They did. All of it came back clear. But since you still have doubts—" He reached into his jacket pocket. Slowly, deliberately, he pulled out a small leather wallet and flipped it open. A gold badge gleamed in the cabin light, next to a photo ID that read, "Federal Bureau of Investigation, Special Agent Marcus Carter." Gasps rippled from nearby rows. The businessman let out a short laugh of disbelief. One passenger whispered, "He's FBI?" while another muttered, "Well, that explains a lot." The woman's face drained of color. Her confident expression vanished, replaced by wide eyes and a frozen stare at the badge. Marcus held it steady for a moment, then closed the wallet and slid it back into his jacket. "I'm on my way home from an assignment," he said evenly. "I was hoping for a quiet flight. I'd appreciate it if we could all enjoy the rest of it without any more interruptions." The woman swallowed hard, her voice suddenly smaller. I didn't realize—" Marcus gave a faint, polite smile. That's often the case. Without another word, he stepped back to his seat. The businessman shook his head, grinning. "I think you just made this the most memorable flight any of us have had." Marcus buckled his seatbelt, leaned back, and let the cabin return to its natural rhythm. There were still whispers, of course, but they were no longer about suspicion. They were about the man in seat 12A, the quiet passenger who turned out to be an FBI agent. and for the first time since boarding, Marcus allowed himself to fully relax. After the badge reveal, the atmosphere in the cabin shifted completely. Where there had been tense whispers and uneasy glances before, there was now quiet respect and a touch of curiosity. The hum of conversation was different, lighter, as though a heavy cloud had finally moved away. Marcus sat calmly in his seat, hands resting on his lap, his gaze fixed on the clouds outside the window. He didn't look like a man seeking attention. In fact, he seemed almost uncomfortable with it. But there was no avoiding the fact that people now saw him differently. A middle-aged man across the aisle leaned over. "Agent Carter, sir. Sorry, about earlier. Some of us didn't know what was going on." Marcus gave him a polite nod. "No problem. I understand how quickly misunderstandings can spread." The businessman beside Marcus chuckled. "You handled that better than most people would have. I think half the cabin would have lost their temper by now." Marcus smiled faintly. "It's part of the job. Staying calm when it matters." A flight attendant passed by offering drinks again. She stopped at Marcus's row and gave him a grateful look. "Thank you for being so patient with all of this, sir. We appreciate it." Marcus nodded. "I appreciate your professionalism. You handled it well." The attendant smiled and moved on. From a few rows back, the woman in the maid white sweater sat stiffly, her eyes fixed on the seat back in front of her. She hadn't pressed the call button again. She hadn't spoken to the crew. She simply sat in silence, clearly aware that everyone knew what had just happened. For the next hour, the flight was quiet. People settled into reading, watching movies, or napping. The tension from earlier seemed almost like a distant memory. Almost. It was only when the pilot announced they'd be starting their descent soon that Marcus felt a light tap on his shoulder. He turned to see the woman standing in the aisle beside him. She didn't look defiant anymore. Her face was pale, her expression uncertain. "Agent Carter," she began quietly, "I wanted to say I'm sorry. I misjudged you." Marcus looked at her steadily. There was no anger in his eyes, only a calm, measured patience. "You did," he said plainly. She nodded, swallowing. "I thought I was doing the right thing, but I see now I was wrong. I should have trusted the crew's word. Instead of pushing so much," Marcus considered his reply carefully. "Being cautious isn't wrong, but letting assumptions guide your actions can hurt people or make situations worse. Next time, try asking before assuming." The woman's shoulders dropped slightly. "I will. I really am sorry." Marcus gave a small nod. "Apology accepted. Let's just hope this is a lesson that sticks." She managed a faint smile before returning to her seat. The businessman raised an eyebrow. "You're a better man than me. I would have let her stew in that embarrassment without saying a word." Marcus chuckled softly. Sometimes a quiet lesson works better than a loud one. The descent continued smoothly, and soon the familiar sight of the city skyline appeared beneath them. The late afternoon sun bathed the buildings in gold, and the patchwork of streets and parks grew larger as they approached the airport. When the plane touched down, there was the usual shuffle of movement, seatbelts clicking, overhead bins opening, people stretching after hours of sitting. Marcus remained seated, waiting for the crowd to thin. He had no need to rush. As passengers filed out, several gave him polite nods or murmured thanks, not for being an FBI agent, but for how he had handled himself. One man even said, "You gave me something to think about on how I treat people I don't know." Marcus appreciated that more than any dramatic praise. When the aisle was clear, he stood, retrieved his small carry-on, and headed toward the exit. The captain was at the door, greeting passengers as they left. He extended a hand to Marcus. "Agent Carter, pleasure having you on board. Sorry for the trouble earlier." Marcus shook his hand. "You and your crew did everything right. Safe. Flying With that, he stepped into the jet bridge, the cool air from the terminal greeting him. He walked with his usual steady pace, blending into the stream of travelers. In minutes, the noise of the airport replaced the hum of the airplane. Outside the terminal, the city stretched before him. People rushed by, luggage rolling, voices calling out greetings. For Marcus, it was just another day, another flight, another reminder that the world could surprise you, for better or worse. But as he hailed a cab and gave his home address, he allowed himself a rare thought. Maybe this incident would ripple further than he'd ever know. Maybe one person on that plane would remember, the next time they felt quick judgment rising, to pause and see the person in front of them instead of their own assumptions. And if that happened, even once, the uncomfortable hours in seat 12A would have been worth it. The taxi merged into traffic, carrying Marcus away from the airport. He leaned back, closed his eyes, and finally let the day's tension fade. He had work ahead of him, but for now, he was going home. And that was enough.